Okay, moving right along here in John David Ebert 101. We're at lecture number 4, and this time we'll be talking about Jean Gebser, who is probably, after Spengler, my second favorite thinker of all time. And in many ways, Gebser is a kind of sequel to Spengler and provides a kind of corrective view, whereas Spengler has this, what he calls, as we have seen, a Copernican revolution, where we can no longer see the West as the center of the world, with all the other civilizations revolving around it and sort of steps on the way leading up to it as the apogee. Spengler rejects that paradigm and instead provides turns it upside down and says, not only does all our industrialization and technological progress isn't the center of history, but it's actually a decline. It actually represents the terminal phase of a great civilization. They all end the same way, with this shift into the sciences, out of the humanities, into the sciences, into technology, and into pragmatic concerns. Gebser, in a certain sense, on the other hand, will provide us once again with a kind of linear model with his 5 structures of consciousness. And now, Gebser is interesting because he has read Spengler, and whereas Spengler sees in the middle of the 19th century, right when modernism begins to kick in, it starts in France during the Haussmannization of Paris, in the 1850s, and then in the 1860s in the art world there with Manet first, and then in poetry there with Baudelaire. That's the birth of modernism, phase 1. That's about the time that Spengler sees the West beginning its descent, beginning its decline. Now at exactly this same time, Gebser will come in and say, actually, I see something different here. This isn't a decline. It's a mutation of consciousness, a whole new structure of consciousness, what he calls the integral consciousness structure, is coming into being here, and Spengler just missed it. He was too close to it, he didn't see it, but Gebser did. So we'll look at that in a second. Gebser eventually, he was friends with Picasso. He hung out in Spain with Garcia Lorca for a while. His apartment was bombed just a few hours after leaving it during the war there, with Franco, the Civil War there going on. So he narrowly escaped that, and eventually he wound up in Switzerland at Bollingen in Jung's world. So he is, in a way, he exists somewhere in between Jung and Spengler, who, despite the fact that Jung deals with psychology and Spengler deals with history, the structure of their thinking is pretty much the same in both cases. And Gebser hovers somewhere in between. He was giving lectures there to Jungians out at Bollingen, so he's very familiar with Jung's world. Lecturing on it, but he can't really be considered a Jungian because he's too critical of Jung all through his book, which came out, volume 1, again, like Spengler's Decline of the West, 2 volumes, 1949 with volume 1, and then a few years later with volume 2. So you can't really regard him as a Jungian. He's kind of the anti-Jungian. He was a rebel against Jung's whole worldview, which he saw as too simplistic, too simplistically dualistic, conscious and unconscious. It's dualistic. That belongs to the mythical consciousness structure, which is polaristic. So he'll situate Jung within that. Whereas his model is based on almost like geological strata in the history of human consciousness. But I am convinced that Gebser probably got the idea for his model from Jung's seminar that he gave on Kundalini Yoga in 1936. And his model does indeed remind me of the dream that Jung had when he was on board the ship with Freud going to America, to Clark University to give lectures there. And he had the dream which he later regarded as the seed idea for his later idea of the collective unconscious, where he goes into a house and there's a sort of Baroque drawing room, and then he goes down a ladder into the next level, and then it's a medieval room, and then a next level where it's a Roman villa, and then finally down into the basement where he finds Neolithic pottery shards, and ultimately all the way back to 2 skulls, which he associated with kind of Adam and Eve type figures. So we have the idea of the collective unconscious, even in Jung, as having layers to it, strata, like geological strata. And then when Jung gives the seminar on Kundalini Yoga, he sort of retranslates Kundalini Yoga from the chakras and a psychological understanding of them to a historical understanding. And he says, well, look, the chakras could be understood as a kind of evolution of a recapitulation of the history of human consciousness. It starts in the lower levels, especially with the 3rd chakra at the level of the belly, that has to do with the will to power. But at the level of the belly, this is like Jung saying this, Aboriginals, peoples being concerned with things like horoscopy and seeing consciousness down in the intestines in that world. And then it moves up to the heart, where with high civilization, especially Egypt, we get this idea that consciousness is located in the heart. So in Egypt, we have the heart in the judgment of the dead weighed against the feather of the goddess Ma'at, the goddess of truth. And all the way down to Aristotle, it was taught that the heart was the seat of the soul, the center of consciousness. Then the Kundalini serpent moves all the way up to the head, and eventually we get to the modern understanding of the brain as the seat of consciousness, as the center of consciousness. I'm convinced Gebser knew this lecture, and that it gave him the idea for the ever-present origin, which then I want to move into next. Now, one last thing before we do that is recall that in the previous lecture on Spengler, we had seen how with Spengler and with Toynbee's idea of 3 different generations of civilization, we had Spengler's idea that the first generation of civilization with Egypt and Mesopotamia was pre-philosophical. This was a civilization that was inclined to myth and religion. They never developed philosophy. And that the second generation that came in after the Turan Indo-Aryan amoeba invaded them and created Greece and India and China and Persia, this is the philosophical civilization par excellence. And so this matches nicely with Gebser's idea of the mythical consciousness structure, which he sees associated with that first generation, and the mental/rational consciousness structure, which he sees associated with the Greeks and the Hebrews coming in, and possibly also with the Indians and the Chinese. But either way, it's a perfect segue into Gebser to follow that conduit. And so with Gebser, we have 5 structures of consciousness in his book, The Ever-Present Origin. The origin is ever-present because it's always there as a ground of origin from out of which new consciousness structures will spring. The German title is Ursprung und Gegenwart. So Ursprung, with the sound of the word spring in there, as a leap, a mutation of consciousness. So the earliest level of human consciousness that he describes in that book is what he calls the archaic consciousness structure, which we don't know much about. And he doesn't say that much about it. It just goes all the way back into the dim reaches of our hominid, maybe 5 million year ancestry. So we don't know that much about it, except that it's very inceptual, unified, and central. Then we get the first real mutation of consciousness for Gebser is the magical consciousness structure, which comes into being during the Upper Paleolithic. Lower Paleolithic is down about 2 million years. Upper Paleolithic is demarcated here about 30,000 years ago, 30 to 40,000, when all of a sudden, with the arrival of modern Homo sapiens, used to be called Cro-Magnon man, coming up out of Palestine and migrating across into Europe by 40,000 BC, which at that time was inhabited by Neanderthals, who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. But the Neanderthals didn't really have much art, not art in any sense in which we would speak of it. They might have had, some scholars think that they might have had tattoos. They might have used black manganese and red ochre for their tattoos. And they did bury their dead, and they did have a cave bear cult, where they had cave bear skulls. So we know that much. They did have that much culture. But it's with the Cro-Magnons that suddenly we get what Johnny Pfeiffer calls the creative explosion. The oldest of the caves is Chauvet Cave, 33,000 BC, and it's about the same time that we get the earliest sculpture coming in from Eastern Europe. There seems to be a somewhat different culture zone. We get the sculpture from these little handheld figurines like mammoths and horses, and in one case a shaman standing up wearing a lion suit, or the lion shaman animal master figure. And then in the West we get these painted caves starting with Chauvet, and then evolving all the way down to about 12,000 BC. This is the origins of the magical consciousness structure, and as we'll see in our next discussion on shamanism, it's also the origins of shamanism. Shamans are here. Shamanism represents the earliest form of human religiosity, and it is tied into hunters, the world of the hunt, what Joseph Campbell calls the way of the animal powers. This is the world of the hunt, this is the world of shamanism, and it is Gebser's magical consciousness structure in which everything is bound together. The cosmology for it that he gives is everything is bound together in a kind of point-like unity, so that with magic, everything is connected to everything else, and if you want something to happen, you only need to manipulate something over here. And he gives an example from Leo Frobenius where these pygmies are going out and they're going to hunt. Whatever's in the forest there. They draw a picture of it on the ground, the animal, and then right when the sun rises, they throw the spear at the picture. So then they go out, they hunt the animal, and by the end of the day, they do indeed bring it back with the spear wound in it and erase the image and sprinkle the animal's blood on it. So in the magical consciousness structure, you can make things happen. It's pars pro toto. You only need the part of the world because each part is holographic. It contains the whole world within it, and therefore can be manipulated through magic, through the magical consciousness structure. Things like telepathy are real in this structure. Telepathy, synchronicity, the paranormal, all these things are real phenomena within the magical consciousness structure. But then we get the mutation to what Gebser calls the mythical consciousness structure, which takes place in the Neolithic, which is the epoch which Joseph Campbell calls the way of the seeded earth. Agriculture has come in, settled village life has come in. All of this takes place in the Middle East, especially along the Euphrates, in the eastern or the western part of the Middle East, and on up into Turkey. And now we get the mother goddess cults coming into being. We get human sacrifice also at the site of Chayonu, 8000 BC, and we get a new set of myths and a new set of ideas that begin to create the world not as a unity but as a polarity. The yin-yang symbol is perfect for the mythical consciousness structure, and we start getting myths. When it does inceptualize with the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, we do start getting myths of the world parents, the universe splits into usually a sky father and an earth mother from their act of sex that then produces the world, the pantheon of the gods. In Egypt, it's reversed. It's the earth father, Geb, and the sky mother, Nut. But it's still the same separation of the world parents. And everything is polaristic. It's not monistic as it is in the magical. It's polaristic. Everything is a series of dichotomies of night, day, light, dark, male, female, the sky above, the earth below. So we have this separation of the world into these pairs of opposites, and that is the mythical consciousness structure, and it does correspond, even though it overlaps with Spengler's Neolithic and his world of the three different cultural amoebae. They do overlap with the first generation of civilization, as Spengler sees it with the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, and as Toynbee provides the model of the three separate generations. And so that's the mythical consciousness structure. And then with the coming of the Greeks and the Hebrews, we get the mutation into a mental consciousness structure, also known as rational. It's easier to remember it as the three M's: magical, mythical, mental, with the Greeks and Greek pre-Socratic philosophy. We also get philosophy in India and China simultaneously going on here. That cannot be an accident. This goes across the board. But Gebser focuses on the Greeks and the Hebrews. And what they have in common, Gebser's model might be illuminated a bit with Franz Borkenau's model that he gives. Borkenau was a scholar of history of both Toynbee and Spengler and was interested in reconciling them. He was Austrian, initially communist, but later not. And we only have one book from him, really, is The End and Beginning. So he was interested in the beginnings of civilizations and their decline, their ending. But he has this idea about death cults and burials. There's an oscillation he sees. He's thinking of Gebser's three different generations. And then he maps onto them this idea that with these generations, there are two different attitudes toward death. The first is death accepting, and the second is death transcending. And the death accepting civilizations are the first two. The Egyptian death transcending rather are the first two, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. They're death transcending. They're more interested in the afterworld than in this world. And for the Egyptians, the other world was the whole point of life. Egypt was the great funerary civilization par excellence. You spent your whole life having someone build a tomb for you if you were a pharaoh or a noble, and you had access to those resources. That's what you did. So this is death transcendence, where the physical world pales by comparison with the other world. Then with the second generation, with the Greeks and the Hebrews, we get what Borkenau terms death accepting. Both the Greeks and the Hebrews, neither one were interested in the afterlife. It goes dark for them. When Odysseus goes down in the Odyssey into the underworld, he encounters a dark, gloomy world of twittering shades. The underworld wasn't dark for the Egyptians at all. It was a very brightly lit place. And with the Hebrews, we get this idea of the underworld as Sheol, the pit into which you throw the dead. They buried all their dead in caves which is the earliest burial practice that we know of. It goes all the way back to the Neanderthals. They buried their dead in caves. Neither one of them were much interested in the other world. They were interested in this world. So they're death accepting in that sense. And then with the coming of the Christians, though, for Borkenau, we get a return back to death transcendence. With the Christians coming in, we get a renewed interest in the other side. And we start getting all these ascents into the heavens with all these beings, Christ ascending into the heavens, all these celestial journeys, all the way down to Dante, who sort of concludes this epoch with his Divine Comedy as the final ultimate ascent through this world, which is then followed in the Renaissance by, again, a return to death accepting. The Renaissance is very this worldly. It's not otherworldly. It's very concretely here, very much interested in what's going on down here, not so much on the other side. So we get a return back to the original, or the secondary death accepting. And then finally, Borkenau says, what we have today is something new, death denial, where for the first time in history, we deny the afterlife and the other side and the existence of the soul. This is a pretty pathetic situation. So that's Borkenau's brief model about the death cults. And then with Gebser, then we have the mutation with the mental consciousness structure. So we can see what the Hebrews and the Greeks have in common, though the Hebrews are fundamentally religious. The Greeks are too, but they have sort of one foot in philosophy, one foot in religion. But they both share this turning away from the other world that marks the inception of a new structure of consciousness, the mental, rational consciousness structure that achieves its second phase, about where Borkenau said with the Renaissance, we get the turn to the death accepting again with the discovery of depth perspective in painting in the 15th century. We get the second phase, is Gebser terms perspectival. It's the perspectival phase of the mental consciousness structure. Everything is seen as having a vanishing point. Everything is in space, and we get this idea of space as a whole new revelation, which does map onto Spengler's idea that the Faustian idea, the primary symbol of the Faust, is infinite space. And that includes depth perspective in the Gothic cathedral and its expanse into the heavens, and the inevitable with that a priori worldview ascent to the moon. So here we have Gebser discussing, as the book opens up, actually, he's discoursing on this idea of the perspectival consciousness phase of the mental consciousness structure, which let's say is mental consciousness phase 2, and its emphasis on rationality, which eventually devolves into a degenerate form of hyper-rationality that now then in the middle of the 19th century, precisely as we started, where Spengler sees this arc coming to an end with the decline of the West and the shift into technological pragmatism, Gebser now sees the inception of a new structure of consciousness, what he calls the integral, also aperspectival. So we get aperspectivity now, the disintegration of space and perspectively correct space in art starts to take place with Manet. As we have said, the birth of modernism takes place with him in art. But he's the first in, let's say, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe of 1861 or 2, to start breaking space off, breaking it apart. The woman in Breakfast on the Grass, where they're all sitting around, and then there's a woman behind them who's bending over, like in a lake stream or whatever it is. If she were perspectively correct in that painting, she would have to be a 9-foot tall giant. So space is beginning to become aperspectival, and it becomes so and develops more and more through the two phases of modernism. Modernism phase 1, modernism phase 2, that begins with Picasso and James Joyce. And now this is a new structure. This is the integral consciousness structure for Gebser, in which all the earlier previous structures of consciousness now can be reactivated. They're all integrated together, and these other layers of consciousness can be reactivated. If you're having poltergeist phenomena or a haunting in your house, the magical consciousness structure has been reactivated in that household. If you're going to the movies, you're watching the mythical consciousness structure, and so forth. You're reading a book, you're in the mental consciousness structure. And so these earlier consciousness structures don't just disappear for Gebser. They can be reactivated and brought back, which is what the integral consciousness structure does. And this is basically Gebser's idea of modernism. We could say as a criticism that this is really modernism that Gebser liked and appreciated, which Jung and Spengler did not, which both he and Joseph Campbell appreciated modernist art quite a bit. And this is his way of sort of conferring synthetic unity on the manifold of all the different phenomena of modernism. Here it is. But my problem with it is that it's very Eurocentric, and these earlier consciousness structures had been planetarily universal. They were global, whereas this one now is Eurocentric. So I have my doubts about it. I have suspicions about it being a valid structure of consciousness. I think I prefer Spengler's model, that this is a disintegration. Modernism is a decline and a disintegration into shards and fragments. When you look at a Cubist painting, what you're looking at is disintegrated shards and fragments, which have been arranged on a canvas. And so we'll stop there. So that brings us up to date here with Gene Gebser. And then we'll seek right in through Gebser's magical consciousness structure into a discussion of shamanism for our next lecture.